Thank you, Miriam, and I want to also thank the theology faculty at the FU, who's welcomed me these last 5 months or so, and for the next 7 months or so, continue to work on this project with Miriam van Veen and to finish some of my final research, some of which I will share with you today. Martin Visse asked me to think about ways in which my perspective as a historian of religions in the 16th century might offer insights for people working on dissertations today. And so I've tried to do that in a paper I call Seeing Like a Church, Using Confessional Categories or Uncovering Confessional Diversity in the 16th Century. I want to start to reflect on methodological challenges for scholars aiming to understand religious cultures of the 16th century. But in order to do so, allow me to recount the history of something that never happened. In the first days of November 1568, over 50 Calvinist leaders from the Netherlands stealthily made their way from underground locations and foreign refuges to Wesel, the largest city in the neighboring German Duchy of Clèves. These dissenters were enemies of the state, living in secrecy as they planned ways that they might achieve victory for what they believed was the true Church of God. The Duke of Clèves and city officials looked the other way as delegates drafted a set of articles that laid out the structure and ritual for a new church. The efforts of these men were not in vain. In 1572, a military campaign by rebels led to the capture of large swaths of the Netherlands. Calvinists were finally able to implement their plan, forming the Dutch Reformed Church, the public church of the new republic. In the coming years, Calvinists in northwest Germany also used the articles drawn up at Wesel as a model for their new churches. To the left here is a picture of Wesel, and to the right is a gold coin minted for the 400-year anniversary of the event. This account offers a brief narrative of an event now generally called the Convent of Wesel, one of the foundational moments in the formation of Reformed churches in the Netherlands and northwest Germany. By the mid-16th century, that is, as Lutherans and Catholics were constructing new churches in the post-Reformation world, the Convent of Wesel marked an early step in this process for Reformed Protestants in this region of Europe. Generally, scholars describe this trend as the rise of confessionalism. My research has uncovered, however, that the Convent of Wesel was an idea invented by historians generations later. The only evidence about this supposed grand event comes from a 24-page Latin manuscript here, now resting at the Utrechtsarchief. The text offers a list of articles that were intended to serve as an outline for the new Reformed Church, followed by 63 signatures. And there's the signatures, the first of the signatures there. There's Petrus Dathenus, Peter Dathene, and there's more signatures here. The title of the document there reads in English, certain specific chapters or articles that have been judged to be partly necessary and partly useful in the service of the Church of the Netherlands. The terms Convent of Wesel or National Synod of Wesel, as the meeting also became known, never appear. What's most remarkable about the Convent of Wesel is the lack of evidence of its very existence, which stands in contrast to the literally hundreds of books and articles that use it as a record of Reformed church building. There's no reference to it in the archives in the Netherlands, Germany, or England that contain extensive correspondence among exiles, records of other organizational efforts, or a host of civil and ecclesiastical documents. For 50 years, not one person ever mentioned the event. Now, I stumbled upon this curious little puzzle by accident. Many of you have known it for years. My research, starting over a decade ago, centered on understanding patterns of religious pluralism after the Reformation. My first book, which is pictured here, aimed to uncover how it was that people of competing religious truths and who did not value religious toleration learned to live together. I chose to study the German city of Wesel, which was home to local Lutherans and Catholics, but also Reformed and Anabaptist refugees from the Habsburg Netherlands. In the process, I uncovered new evidence and perspectives about the so-called Convent of Wesel. As I studied this centuries-long mystery, I came to see that its solution forces historians to reconsider how they interpret the Reformation. Historians, even today, I argue, are sometimes complicit in the process of forgetting the diverse and pluralistic reality of life during the Reformation and reinventing a clear narrative of origins. This brings me to my title, Seeing Like a Church. I adapted the phrase from one used by an American anthropologist, James C. Scott, who described what he called seeing like a state, and this is his book here. He was primarily interested in understanding how many of the ways that we organize our understanding of the world conform to the interests of the nation state. In his treatment, the state operates as a kind of abstract agent on ordinary people, a kind of boogeyman. Recently, a historian of 19th century Mexico, Raymond Crabe, has offered a useful corrective to Scott's seeing like a state by humanizing state officials as well as the ordinary people they interacted with. I've adopted this more nuanced approach. But the logic of seeing like a state remains. Adopting standardized surnames, for instance, allowed state officials to keep track of its citizens, which allowed for taxation, which allowed for expanding state infrastructure. Census documents that categorize people according to racial or ethnic categories can serve similar interests. The example of the Hutus and Tutsis in Belgian-ruled Rwanda is an example of this. Museum displays can work in similar ways. They can normalize national identities and identify foreigners as others, helping visitors understand their place in a larger world. The quotidian nature of this organization can render it almost unconscious for both the organizers of knowledge and its consumers, such that the categories can come to feel wholly natural and inevitable. One of the most important ways that seeing like a state affects historians involves the organization of historical knowledge in archives. Here's the Utrechtsarchief on the right. The late German historian Peter Rück made this point, arguing that government archives mirror the power of governmental systems they serve. Archives, I would add, not only act as mirrors of government power, but they are also aspirational. They can, in some cases, reflect how their sponsors wished the world was as much as how it actually worked. In this sense, archives are not mere repositories of history, but generative agents for the future. Archiving, or as the Dutch scholar Eric Ketelaar calls it, archivalization, is a prescriptive act that claims to be descriptive. The medieval Savoyard state archives that Peter Rück studies are a good case in point. The ducal collections aimed far more at creating a bureaucratic and centralized state system than reflecting the existence of one. I'll come to the Reformation here in a second. Archives also imagine the world as far more ordered and intelligible than could ever be the case. These points pose challenges for archivists, too, but not one that I propose to solve on their behalf. I'm more interested in the problems it poses for historians. That is, we need to make ourselves aware of the narratives embedded in archival organizations of knowledge if we're ever going to be successful in developing ways of responding to how it can affect our understanding of the past. It also helps us understand the question of how an event that has no evidence supporting it found its way into so many histories of the Reformation, from the confessional histories of the 19th century to 21st century revisionist studies, including my own. I used it in some of my earliest publications this way. For scholars of the Reformation, one of the greatest challenges we face is that sometimes archives can see like a church. That is, preserve information and organize evidence in ways that serve the interests of those advocating for confessional churches in the 17th and 18th centuries. Seeing like a church entails that we see all the evidence in the history of the Reformation in relation to the goal of construction of confessional churches, and can sometimes lead historians to misunderstand evidence that did not align with those interests. It's not surprising that 17th century historians and theologians who collected evidence tended to do this. What's more surprising is that in our 21st century post-confessional academic culture, we can sometimes inadvertently do this as well. Understanding this helps us understand the 450-year-old mystery and generally better appreciate the complexity of 16th century religions. Let me now turn back to the convent of Wesel. While the convent of Wesel never happened, most assuredly something did happen in Wesel on November 3rd, the date given on the document, and you can see the bottom of the text there. That past August, the rebel leader, William of Orange, energetically raised money and hired soldiers for a military campaign against Habsburg rule. By the end of the month, he had secured roughly 30,000 troops. The massive army crossed into the Netherlands there, not far from Wesel itself, on October 5th. As reformed exiles in Germany and England waited for news, a few enthusiastic refugees began making plans for a possible takeover. One such man was this man, Petrus Dathenus. I prefer using Dathenus, but I think most of you know who I mean. A Dutch minister who had been working hard to organize his co-religionists for years. At the time, Dathenus was serving as a minister to Dutch Reformed exiles in Frankenthal in the Palatinate. That autumn, he penned the articles, consulting his friend and colleague Hermanus Moded, who worked as a minister to exiles in Norwich, England. As news of Orange's campaign was spreading, Moded and Dathenus happened to both be in Switzerland. Moded was there getting advice in Geneva and Zurich about largely unrelated conflicts among the exiles in England. Dathenus was on his way back from France, where he was learning about Calvinist organization from his French co-religionists. Having learned about Orange's campaign, Dathenus sprung into action. He wrote a series of articles that he hoped might serve as a basis for a new church order, should Orange prove successful. The articles made recommendations on a variety of liturgical and ecclesiological issues. Broadly speaking, Dathenus wrote 3 kinds of articles. The first simply reflected long-standing agreements among the Reformed movement in the Netherlands. Several articles called for a Presbyterian form of governance, for instance. A second set of articles took a stand on debates within the Reformed movement. In this case, they tended to push in a particular direction, towards models of Geneva, France, and the Palatinate, where Dathenus worked, and away from models used by Reformed refugees in Basel, Emden, London, and Norwich. For instance, the document endorsed the Heidelberg Catechism used in the Palatinate. Dathenus, as it turned out, had recently translated that document for his own church and is advocating its use elsewhere, apparently preferring it to the catechisms written by John Alasco and Martin Micron, which were used in the London and Emden churches. The third group are those articles that reflected a rather idiosyncratic vision. For instance, they stipulated that women could be elected to the office of deacon, a view that no leading reformer shared, although occasionally churches did elect deaconesses, as they were called. After drafting the articles, Dathenus traveled down the Rhine with Moded, who was on his way back to England, to collect signatures on the document. He collected a few signatures in Basel in a series of meetings. The first seems to have included 15 men. Others signed in subsequent days or weeks. Dathenus then handed the document over to Moded to take with him back to England while he returned to the Palatinate. On his way to London, Moded stopped briefly in Emden, where he collected 22 more signatures. There, a Dutch translation was made, which has not survived, except that a copy of that translation later found its way into the Mennonite archive in Amsterdam, and I'll come back to that document later. After Moded arrived in London, the last signatures were added in at least 3 separate meetings. In all 3 cities, the signers of the manuscript constituted an assortment of ministers and elders, sympathetic nobles and laymen who lived in and around these cities. Historians have assumed that since the signatures all follow the date on the manuscript, that the signers had in fact met on that date and at that time. This has presented those who studied the meeting with a dilemma, because there's no evidence that any such gathering happened, but there's plenty of evidence that the signers could not have been there on November 3rd, 1568. Most have explained away contrary evidence by claiming that participants must have successfully orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to keep any mention of this assembly out of the records or to falsify those records. As it turned out, solving the mystery becomes relatively straightforward once we learn that the idea that the manuscript offered evidence of a large gathering of delegates was invented by later historians, which I'll describe in a few minutes. Indeed, all the evidence lines up once we realize that it was the manuscript, not its signers, that was moving. One also might imagine a certain unanimity among the signatories. In fact, the opposite is true. The men who signed the articles did not represent the leadership or any coherent faction of the Reformed movement in the Netherlands. Many didn't live in accordance with the principles articulated within them. A number of signers were ministers who held positions in churches that were not even Reformed, but were ecumenical or mixed churches that characterized much of the Rhineland, where clergy often ministered to Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed, as was the case in Basel. Consider Philip Raesfeld, for instance. His name is just here. He was a German minister working in Erla, a village in the Catholic Prince-Bishopric of Munster. While Raesfeld claimed to be Lutheran, his practices could better be described as idiosyncratic. He celebrated communion, for instance, by dipping the host into the wine before offering it to communicants. Episcopal authorities clearly recognized that this was not Catholic, but neither did it correspond to standard Lutheran or Reformed practices. In baptism, meanwhile, Raesfeld followed the Wittenberg rite. There's no reason to have attended the supposed meeting of Dutch Calvinist churches. Another interesting case is the German clergyman Gerhard van Rad, and his name is just here. Before signing the document, Van Rad had been a Catholic priest, and then a Lutheran pastor, and then a Catholic priest again. His decision to sign the document suggests that he shifted allegiances yet again, except that a year later, he took another Catholic post in the Archbishopric of Cologne. In 1571, he returned to Wesel, working as a minister in the mixed church there. His signing of the document hardly reveals a commitment to Calvinism or even Reformed tradition generally, let alone wholehearted approval of the Articles. In fact, Van Rad's signing of the document was only one more example of his religious flexibility. We see a similar pattern of moving between Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed posts in the career of yet another signer, Jacobus Michaelis. While these men never explained their decision to sign, clearly doing so represented only general support for any non-Roman church or reflected their remarkable flexibility on a range of liturgical and ecclesiological points. That is, the document was not the result of a successful act of church building. Rather, it might be thought of better as a petition. Dathenus wrote the Articles and hoped to get as many signers on it as he could in case Orange was successful. In recent years, Orange had been working not only to convince Reformed leaders to sign the Augsburg Confession, but also to establish a religious peace on the model of the Peace of Augsburg in the Holy Roman Empire. Dathenus and Moded had been among those who resisted this effort, as did many who did not sign it, Dathenus and Moded hoped to present a reasonable alternative with enough support that Orange would agree to adopt Reformed standards for the new public church. The urgency of their task encouraged Dathenus and Moded to compromise on who they got to sign, accepting signatories without much regard for their orthodoxy. They were, of course, in a rush and probably growing a little frantic. All we know about 14 other signers is that they were not ministers or elders of any Reformed church and were never involved in any similar recorded efforts at church building. Meanwhile, men who we might well have expected to have been involved, who had been active in such organizational efforts, like Franciscus Junius, Jean Taffin, Adrianus Seravius, and Jasper van der Heyden, did not sign the Articles. In a few cases, local concerns led even those who were Calvinists and who were present when and where the manuscript was circulating to remain aloof from the effort. Consider the example of the ministers of Norwich. Antonius Auchud and Carolus Reichwart signed the document, but Isebrand Balk did not. All were Orthodox Calvinists. It turns out they were involved in a heated debate on issues not discussed in Dathenus' Articles, about whether godparents was allowed and the righteousness of supporting violence in the name of God. For these ministers, signing seems to have reflected the fault lines within their local church, which were unrelated to the content of the Articles themselves. Thus, how each man understood the act of signing reflected his own specific context, at least as much or perhaps more than what the Articles actually said. Meanwhile, while Dathenus and Moded were sharing the Articles, William of Orange was still battling it out in the Netherlands. While there was no decisive battle when he crossed the border in October 1568, though, instead of attacking Orange's much larger army, the Duke of Alba's army simply followed a day behind for several months, waiting for rebel troops to run out of resources. On November 3rd, 1568, when our mysterious manuscript was first signed, Orange was just outside the city of Liège, hoping, in vain as it turns out, that the Prince-Bishop might offer assistance. Still, there was no way that Dathenus could have known of Orange's challenges. Orange's correspondence during these days remained hopeful, even if Dathenus and Moded had access to it, which they didn't. By January 1569, however, news was spreading that Orange's troops were in retreat. The manuscript was quietly set aside in a London archive. By the time that rebel troops had more success in 1572, and did indeed begin building a new church, the Articles had become irrelevant. Yet a document had been produced, and it had been stuck in the archive of Austin Friars, the Dutch church in London, probably sometime in early January 1569, and perhaps by Hermanus Moded. This undramatic act of archiving, never recorded or discussed, would have a long-term impact on the historiography of the Reformation, which many of you are familiar with. The idea that the manuscript constituted evidence of a major meeting of religious leaders was introduced in 1618, when the document was rediscovered. At the time, of course, the Dutch Reformed Church was experiencing a climax of a crisis pitting Calvinists against Remonstrants. Incidentally, our document does not discuss the doctrine of predestination, which was, of course, a central concern of that debate. By 1618, Calvinists secured victory and organized the National Synod of Dort, which condemned the Remonstrants and adopted Calvinist standards for the public church. In preparing a writing to support this assembly, Simeon Rautink, a Dutch minister in London who planned to attend, he was later forbade from doing so by the King of England, discovered the 1568 manuscript in his church's archive, which he described as the National Synod of Wesel in his book, Harmonia Synodorum Belgicarum. That book laid out the complete agreement of all the national meetings of Dutch Reformed leaders, starting with Wesel at 1568. And you can see them all listed there. And for those who are particular experts on this, you'll note that the provincial synod of Dordrecht here is also treated as a national synod of Dordrecht. Which Rautink thus rhetorically answered Calvinist critics who claimed that the standards of orthodoxy were growing increasingly narrow. Not so, Rautink answered. The church had been the same since its inception. Rautink's excitement at the victory of Calvinists, though, caused him to reach beyond his evidence in claims about the manuscript's significance. First, he invented the title National Synod of Wesel to suggest that elected representatives from all the churches had come together at this event to establish the foundations of their faith. He also failed to address why no one had mentioned such an event, and he ignored significant differences between this document and decisions of the later synods. But his readers couldn't have known about these problems. Rautink didn't detail the content of the articles. Doing so, after all, would have undermined the chief assertion of his book. Instead, he summarized the points that supported his religious views without quotes. In this case, the document's preservation in an archive in London was more a historical accident than anything else. Austin Friars just happened to be the last place it was signed before exiles learned of the collapse of Orange's rebellion. But Rautink's connection of that document to a specific narrative of the growth and triumph of Calvinism in the Netherlands made its actual archival preservation far more significant than Dathenus' effort 50 years before. The spirit of excitement in finding evidence for the Calvinist origins of the Dutch Reformation led to the spread of copies of the manuscript into other archival collections in coming years. The key figure here is Johannes Gesius, a Calvinist minister in Streefkerk who wrote a number of histories of the Dutch Reformation. You can see one here on the left. Through the 1630s, Gesius had been searching for any documents that he could find relating to the first years of Calvinist church building. He probably had read about the National Synod of Wesel in Rautink's Harmonia Synodorum Belgicarum and traced the document to Rautink's church in London. I don't know whether he visited London himself to retrieve it, but by 1639 he had gained possession of the original manuscript. He started making transcriptions of it for colleagues to include in church archives in Dordrecht, Breda, and Wesel. And here's the one on the right. The Dordrecht copy is today at the Koninklijke Bibliotheek in The Hague. The Wesel copy still sits at the Evangelische Kirchenarchiv in Wesel. And until recently, I thought the Breda copy was at the Zeeuwsarchief in Middelburg, but my recent research has discovered that's not, in fact, the right copy, and I'm still in search of that one. Gesius then put the original article, original document in the Reformed Church Archive, in the Kloosterkerk in The Hague. Once copies of the original document were available in German and Dutch archives, the story of the National Synod of Wesel found its way into many 17th century Calvinist writings of the Reformation, like Jacobus Tridgland's 1650 Kerkelijke Geschiedenissen, Crispus Voetius's 1663 Politica Ecclesiastica, and both of which are pictured here, and Johannes Hornbeck's Traktaat van de Catechisatie, which is not printed here, but was published in 1654. Meanwhile, a Dutch copy of the document, which was read by those signers in Emden who did not read Latin, a copy of that document was placed by someone into the Mennonite archive in Amsterdam. That's the picture on the right top, where it, not surprisingly, received no attention for over 2 centuries. In the late 17th century, German Calvinists began to cite the Synod of Wesel, using the transcriptions that Gesius had sent to Wesel's church archive. In the 1660s, for instance, Wesel's ministers were using the Synod of Wesel as a yardstick for defining orthodoxy in their debates with one another, for instance, about how proper catechism classes should be going. In the 1680s, Wesel's pastor Anton von Dort added the meeting to a history of the Reformation on the Lower Rhine, titled Annales Ecclesiastici, that had been written before the transcript had arrived in Wesel, so he included it into a pre-existing history. That is, despite the fact that the document was intended as a model for Netherlandish churches, these men began using it to describe the moment when Calvinism was founded in their region of Germany. The context of 17th century Clèves explains what these men found appealing about the idea. According to the Treaty of Xanten in 1614 and the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, 3 confessions had legal permission in the duchy: Lutheran, Reformed, and Catholic. These agreements expanded religious toleration, but they also forced formerly accommodationalist churches, like the one that had developed in Wesel in the 1550s, to pick a side. Magistrates chose the Reformed Church, which aligned them with their prince, the Duke of Brandenburg. 17th century historians, like Anton von Dort, legitimized this categorization by finding the origins of Wesel's Calvinism in the early Reformation. The Synod of Wesel marked the moment of the city's adoption of Calvinism, despite the fact that the only local minister to sign the document, Christian Mostart, had been fired for doing so. German authors, however, only referred to the meeting as the Synod of Wesel, removing the word national to avoid the idea that it was primarily a Dutch event. Up to this point, archives were largely haphazard places, with local ministers like Hesius putting documents in piles for later use. Happening across a document that seemed to offer insights could understandably inspire excitement. But there was little institutional apparatus like catalogs or indexes to help readers make sense of what they were looking at. During the 18th century, the new Enlightenment era culture, with its penchant for rationalization and systemization, began to change this in archives all across Europe. The kinds of evidence preserved in church archives and the organization of that evidence often reinforced specific narratives of the growth and development of confessional churches. For our story, the key moment is 1736, when Dutch churches assigned deputies to catalog the collections held at the Kloosterkerk in The Hague, where Hesius had deposited the document almost 100 years before. The minister assigned to the task, Quintinus Nordberg, and you can see his name here on the list of the signatures of those who had done the work, took responsibility for documents recording the foundational moments of the Dutch church, including our 1568 document. Initially, Nordberg struggled to make sense of it. He made a series of markings. You can see some of the markings here. Here on the side, there's a note here next to Caspar Koolhaas's name as he tried to figure out why Koolhaas must have signed the document. In the end, Nordberg, though, confirmed Rautink's initial conclusion. He provided a title page to the document with the words Authentische Synodal Akte van Wesel van de jaar 1568, and you can see it here on the table of contents. Well, maybe you can't read the words from there, but trust me, that's what it says. He then bound the document in a packet with minutes and articles approved at subsequent synods of the Dutch Reformed Church. He put together a table of contents for the entire collection, which he called the Oude Synodaal Archief. Nordberg also added page numbers on the documents. They now fit together in a sequential narrative that moved from 1 at the Synod of Wesel in 1568 to the National Synod of Dort. At the same time, Nordberg left some tacit admission for some remaining instability. The document from Wesel required confirmation that it was authentic, while the authority of the other documents stood on its own. Nordberg placed the entire packet back in the archive, now filed under the title Acta Synodorum Nationalium. Nordberg's actions in 1736 ensured that anyone turning to the archive to study the history of the Dutch Reformation would find it organized in a way as to reinforce a historical narrative that had been put forth by protagonists in a 17th century conflict between Calvinists and Remonstrants. In this case, Nordberg's authenticating and ordering of the documents of the Kloosterkerk simplified the history of the Dutch Reformation into a linear history that had its origins at the National Synod of Wesel. Even today, anyone looking in the Oude Synodaal Archief, in the Utrechtse Archief, to understand the origins of Reformed church building in the Netherlands will find the document listed first on the archival inventory. While Nordberg left no specific record of his concerns left no specific record of what convinced him to emphasize this document, 2 points are worth noting. First, there was already a well-established tradition describing the document. His authentication surely revealed that the document was a 16th century original and not a copy. It probably never occurred to him that earlier explanations of the document were false. Secondly, he was writing during a time when the historical criticism of advocates of the radical Enlightenment in the Dutch Republic, like Baruch Spinoza, as well as those who promoted a rationalized ecumenical versions of Christianity, were emerging as alternatives to Orthodox churches, including his Dutch Calvinist one. One response to defenders of orthodoxy was to historicize their churches, establishing a detailed record of their long tradition. Authenticating the National Synod of Basel may well have provided this kind of opportunity, although I can't say that for sure. The historical scholarship of the 19th century at first reinforced the place of the National Synod of Basel. Especially influential in the Netherlands were neo-Calvinist authors who revived interest in promoting orthodoxy during a time when liberal attitudes were growing both inside and outside the Dutch Reformed Church. Those with these views became increasingly dissatisfied with the constitution of the new Kingdom of the Netherlands, established in 1815, which gave the king extensive regulatory power over the Dutch Church and forced it to abandon the requirement that ministers conform to the Synod of Dort. By mid-century, one of the most prominent authors with these views was this man, of course, many of you will know him, Guillaume Groen van Prinsterer, who advocated a return to the standards of Dort, the expulsion of theological liberals from the church, and the removal of state interference in church affairs. A key ally of Groen, of course, was Abraham Kuyper, who founded this great institution. In both men's history writing on the Dutch Reformation, we see the Synod of Basel in their explanations of the Calvinist origins of the Dutch Reformed Church. As Kuyper later wrote in his Ons Programme, the puritanical type of our national character came into self-consciousness in 1568. Identifying these origins 4 years before the founding of the Republic supported these men's views that preserving Calvinism depended on a vigorous, voluntary, and self-governing church, not one in which the state interfered by installing liberals as pastors and university theologians. That is, for Kuyper and Groen, the modern separation of church and state was critical to safeguarding their faith, a point that Petrus Stephanus and Hermanus Modet explicitly rejected in 1568. In the mid-1860s, Kuyper, with Groen's help, organized a historical association called the Marnixvereniging, whose central mission was to publish archival sources from the Dutch Reformed churches of the 16th century. And again, many people in this room have used those documents, I'm sure. Kuyper's goal was, as he wrote in a brochure announcing the effort, in de geschiedenis zelve wapenen te zoeken tot afwering van wat anderen met den geest der hervorming strijdig en voor den doer haar grootste stichtingen gevaarlijk zijn. The Society published thousands of pages of archival sources, including the articles of the Synod of Basel, which appeared in the 1889 volume edited by his colleague here at the FU, Frederik Lodewijk Rutgers. A 1980 reprint of that edition has made it the most influential of the Society's publications. There's one just in our office across the way. This is the book that one finds by historians today citing the confessional worldviews of the 16th century. Calvinist authors in the 19th century German Rhineland had similar reasons for protecting the idea of the Synod of Basel. Many highlighted the region's distinct religious tradition, which had ties to Dutch Calvinism, as an alternative to the Prussian king's advocacy of an ecumenical Protestant national church. As a result, they often celebrated the Synod of Basel as a formative moment in the establishment of the Reformed Church, first in Basel and subsequently spreading across the Rhineland and Westphalia. Nothing could be farther from the truth, of course. In 1568, Basel's magistrates were vigorously trying to suppress Calvinist activity, not sponsor it. Indeed, the only 16th century manuscript record that possibly relates to the articles was the firing of the city pastor who signed them, as I said before. The most influential of these German books celebrating the Synod here is shown on the left, was Reformationsgeschichte der Stadt Wesel bis zur Befestigung ihres reformiertes Bekenntnisse durch die Weseler Synode, written by Albrecht Wolters, pastor in Bonn in 1868, and that's Wolters there on the right. That book cast the city's Lutherans as intolerant zealots, led by Tilman Heshusius, described already by André Galdrian, who tried unsuccessfully to impose their doctrine on the city. The book culminates in the Synod of Basel, marking the city's conversion to Calvinism and establishing its foundations in the Rhineland and Westphalia. The work was published for the 300-year commemoration of the Synod, which is here's a picture of how the city's main church was decorated for that festival. It was a 3-day-long festival celebrated by thousands of German and Dutch Protestants together, about which I will not say more, but I'm happy to talk about if you're interested. It's fascinating. the entrenchment of the National Synod in the archive had led it to become a standard example of 19th century historians, at least those with specific reasons for emphasizing it. In opposition were those church historians, like Bernard Classius, who highlighted the moderation and toleration of the Dutch Reformation by emphasizing figures like Desiderius Erasmus. Classius did not ignore the Synod of Basel, but emphasized why it was a minor one. He described it as a work of a small number of intolerant and dogmatic ministers who were trying to impose their faith on a largely tolerant and undogmatic people. So we see a kind of polarized treatment in how this is used in histories of the 19th century. Gradually, this polarized treatment disappeared. The reason for this is connected to the story of how the event changed its name from the National Synod of Basel to the Convent of Basel. To understand this, we need to return to Enlightenment-era history writing, which demanded that historians carefully interrogate their evidence and distance themselves from the confessional histories of the past. The first remarkable contribution came in a 1769 book by Adrianus Schravensande, titled, I'll translate here, 200-year anniversary or commemoration of the First Synod of the Dutch Churches. Schravensande addressed head-on the curious lack of evidence about the supposed event. Indeed, he admitted, given the weakness of the evidence, the vagueness of the text, and the silence about the National Synod of Basel for 50 years, one might reasonably wonder whether it ever happened at all. This is the first time I've seen of anyone wondering that. Still, Schravensande argued his argument that it did happen rested on two key points. First, participants successfully avoided leaving any trace of their activities to keep city officials from being punished for their role in harboring criminals. Second, the silence gave the Duke of Cleves plausible deniability about his willingness to tolerate Calvinists. Unfortunately, these arguments had no evidence to support them, and they ignored plenty of evidence that people were leaving records of similar church-building efforts, and that the city and the ducal governments did not sanction the activities of Calvinists, in fact, often punished them. Schravensande had even seen the original document, which was still in The Hague at this point, and knew that it was not titled National Synod of Basel. Still, he retained the old title. Schravensande faced the same problem as Nordberg before him. He began by assuming that Rauting's claim that the document recorded a national synod was right, and then developed an explanation for why the behaviors of everyone pointed in the exact opposite direction. That nothing of long-term consequence happened in Basel on November 3rd, 1568. In the 19th century, the spread of a new so-called objective and scientific history, most associated with this man here, demanded a level of attention to source criticism that made claims to the Synod of Basel impossible to maintain. The new scientific history might not have been as objective as its proponents claimed, but it did provide an attractive alternative to the confessional histories of the past. The rush toward scientific objectivity attracted theologians and church historians as well. Scholars openly recognized that no evidence proved that the meeting was a national synod. By about 1880, people began to stop referring to the National Synod of Basel. Yet the idea that the document recorded a foundational meeting did not go away. Instead, historians adopted a new title for the meeting, the Convent of Basel, which distanced itself from the discredited term, yet preserved the narrative upon which the original version rested. It was Abraham Kuyper who first used the phrase. Kuyper was not only a leading minister and politician, of course, he had a PhD from the University of Leiden, where he learned the methods of the new academic history. In 1879, his solution to questions about the authority of the manuscript was to rename the meeting the Convent of Basel. The word convent, of course, was a term for meeting, but it had no specialized ecclesiastical usage in the Reformed Church. Kuyper also capitalized the word, implying for readers that it was a formal event that deserved to retain its place in the Reformation. They sort of created a kind of new ecclesiastical term. By the 1890s, the diminution of the meeting's name led to a scholarly consensus. The Convent of Basel was a foundational moment for the Calvinist tradition, both in Germany and the Netherlands, but its decisions were only provisional. This was a conclusion that liberal ecumenicists, Orthodox Calvinists, and secular academic historians alike could all agree upon. About 100 years later, in the late 20th century, two historians, Jan Peter van Doren and Uwe Boersma, developed a new round of reconsiderations of the Convent of Basel. Both argued that the solution to the mysterious lack of evidence were to reimagine where and when the meeting took place. That is, to make the kind of conspiracy even more complicated than it was before. Unfortunately, each raised more questions than it answered, and neither solution produced new evidence. I'm not trying to pick on these authors individually, but to identify a kind of trend in the scholarship overall. I'm not going to give a point-by-point refutation of these articles, but I will make 3 comments. First, the strength of their arguments was that they preserved the general story intact, even if they changed the place and time of the meeting. Like Swavenson, they were arguing backwards. They knew that a meeting described happened, and they worked evidence to try to fit it. Second, by the time I started my research on this project in 2001, no one knew when the meeting happened, where it happened, what it impacted, or who attended. Despite this, historians have continued to cite the convent of Wesel as a window into Calvinist church building, usually with quotes around the term to suggest they know there's a mystery about the strength of the evidence, but they're going to use it anyway. Not everyone does this, but it's a common practice. The history of this one historical document over 450 years points to serious challenges for historians of the Reformation. It forces us to see just how powerful the archive and seeing like a church can be in shaping how we understand the 16th century. For my purposes today, there were 3 critical sets of actions involving archivalization that compounded on one another to transform a minor failed event into a foundational meeting. First was the decision in early 1569 to archive Dathenus' manuscript at Austin Friars in the first place. Second was the decision of Johannes Chrysius in 1639 to move the document from London, relatively peripheral from where historians were working, and to placing it as the first placing it in the Klosterkerk in The Hague. And third was the authentication of that manuscript by Nordberg and the placing it as the first document in the history of the Dutch Reformed church building in the new archives of that church. In each case, relatively commonplace actions, filing, labeling, categorizing, were made within a specific context that shaped the people who performed those actions. Unfortunately, those actions were so ordinary that no one left records that justified or explained those decisions. But once the archive began seeing like a church, it has proved very difficult for anyone to treat Dathenus' 1568 articles as anything but a large-scale meeting that contributed to Reformed church building, even if the authors usually put the phrase in quotes to indicate that they understand there's a mystery about the meeting. Further, when the Dutch government moved the document to the Utrechtsarchief in 2006, the Dutch state took a role in seeing like a church, protecting the organization of knowledge in ways that reflected 17th and 18th century actions and motivations, not the complexity of 16th century realities. I want to conclude today by reflecting not on the original archive in Utrecht, but on 2 copies that were made later. The first, shown here, was a transcription of the Dutch translation made in Emden. That document, as I suggested earlier, had been picked up by a Mennonite in Emden and at some point returned to the Netherlands. How this happened, I'm working to figure out, and I'll be meeting next week with Pete Visser, who's with us here today, to see if he can help me unravel this mystery. I suspect at this point the person who transported the document may have been Hans de Ries, who lived in Emden between 1578 and 1600. There's 2 reasons for this. The first is that he introduced a number of ecclesiastical and liturgical elements that were reformed into the Vaderlander churches of Holland, including things that were part of this document and not others like the Fractio Panis. Second, after de Ries died, his collections were deposited into the Mennonite archive in Amsterdam, where the document was found by the Mennonite church historian Jacob Gijsbert de Hoop Scheffer, who in 1883 produced an inventory of that archive's collections. Those archives are now currently housed at the Staatsarchief Amsterdam. The work was clearly of minor importance to de Hoop Scheffer, who filed it in the very last set of miscellaneous documents with little relevance to Mennonite history, including a letter from Dirk Volkerts Kornhert, some writings of Baruch Spinoza, and some French state edicts against Huguenots. De Hoop Scheffer cataloged it as, I'll translate it, 120 articles at the Synod of Paris for the service of the Dutch Reformed churches and their church order, translated from Latin. And you can see, if you can read either one of those versions, that's the top is from the original manuscript itself, not the inventory, and the bottom is from the title page produced sometime later. Whoever got the idea this was records of a meeting of the Synod of Paris in 1575, I may never know. But the confusing inventory, combined with the placement of the document in a Mennonite archive, have resulted in almost no one giving attention to this curious little document. Now consider a second document, Chrysius' transcript that he sent to the Classis archive in Dordrecht in 1639. Today, the document rests at the Koninklijke Bibliotheek in The Hague, as I said. It is catalogued, again I'll translate, acts and pieces concerning the National Synod of Basel, Emden, Dordrecht, Middelburg, The Hague, and other pieces concerning the church history of this period. If you order that document, you'll get this book here, and you might be able to make out those words. It's titled 27 Rare Treatise, Tracts, and Pieces Important for the Dutch Reformed Church. This was put together sometime after the National Synod of Dort because they include the church order adopted at Dort. Here is the title on the right of the 1612 book, offering what you can see is described as the 4 national synods held before Dort. That would be Emden, Dordrecht, Middelburg, and The Hague. Curiously, upon binding this book together, someone, presumably Hesius, cut open the book and sewed into it Hesius's transcription of the archives of the National Synod of Basel. And you can see here, it's the end of the foreword, and there's the first page of the Acts of Emden, and Hesius's transcription has been inserted into the collection. This was a document read by Jacobus Tüdichlen and countless of other historians between the 17th and the 20th century as a record of the grand event. The tale of these 2 manuscripts, I think, nicely illustrates my point about archival power and seeing like a church in the Reformation. In one case, the archivist didn't know what to make of this strange event and tucked it away with other bits and bobs. Today, no one seems to know anything about it. Certainly, no one has ever written about the synod of the mystery of the Synod of Paris in 1575. In the other case, the archivist seems to know exactly what to do, to physically cut open the records and insert the articles of the National Synod of Basel into a previously existing collection. The result is today, I'm talking to you about this mystery and not this one. The curious history of the convent of Basel is just one example of many, I think, of a methodological challenge for scholars of 16th century religion. That is, we need to be extremely careful about letting the organizational structures and confessional categories of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, which were all shaped by debates that are mostly today long gone, define how we interpret the evidence. Doing so, in many cases, can lead us to misunderstand the diversity and complexities of 16th century religious cultures. Thank you.